All right, thanks very much, Kenton. Thanks, Kenton, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you, Ian, for agreeing to spend some time with us today. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear all right. Yeah? Ian, do you want to just say hello?
Yeah, this in the back, or actually anywhere, you can hear me? Okay, excellent.
So we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. I hope you're all saving up your great audience questions for Ian to ask him about this topic or perhaps other topics that are related. But why don't I start things off by kind of asking you a slightly different question than the question we have up on the screen, which is who can you trust? Why does trust matter?
You know, we had a conversation, you and I, before this event, and you posed these big questions to me. I mean, I think about these issues a lot, but it doesn't mean that they're easy answers to that. Like, I grew up in a time when there were far fewer television channels, when newspapers were really important, where it was pretty obvious to those of us who are consumers of news, and I'm one of those people who, even as a kid, was really interested in the news. It was pretty easy to figure out what news sources you would go to and which ones were trustworthy. And then as the media became more fragmented, that you went from 2 channels to 8 channels to 80 channels to who knows how many now. Social media, of course, the way that newspapers have diminished in influence, it becomes more and more difficult to know even what to consume, much less what to trust. And if you don't know who to trust or what to trust, if you don't believe in institutions or you don't feel that any institution is doing its job properly, then where do you turn? And I think the most vivid example of that in the last few years has been this notion that in the United States, the last presidential election was stolen. Now, it wasn't stolen, you know, and I'm careful about making statements like that, definitive statements about things that are still very much in play and are being debated. But the reality is, there is no evidence that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Far to the contrary. You look at the defamation lawsuits that explored and investigated this and determined that there was no wrongdoing, right? And yet there's still people now who believe that the last election was stolen, and that the next election, if Trump doesn't win, that'll be evidence that it was stolen again. Well, if you feel that your country is the greatest democracy in the world and is the leader in the world, and you don't even trust your own process leading to who is going to be the leader, what do you trust? And interestingly, we all know here in British Columbia that notion in the United States has crept northward. And here in Canada, as the counting continued for the provincial election, there was more and more noise on social media of people wondering what happened, claims that were just untrue about ballots being stolen. And thank goodness the leader of the Conservative Party and the president of the Provincial Conservative Party made categorical statements saying that they trusted the process, which I think went a long way to easing the volume of the doubters, but they're still out there. So trust is really important, and if you trust nothing, then how do we get through the next pandemic, for example? How do we deal with the courts and how they address some major case? And how do we even know whether an election is something that should be believed in? So I do actually really worry about the lack of trust and the senselessness of it. Like, as a journalist, you know, I'm interested in questioning everything, but it doesn't mean that you have to believe in nothing.
There's a difference, I suppose, between skepticism and sort of blind rejection of facts.
Yeah, you think of the continuum, you know, skepticism, like just, you know, gentle questioning, skepticism, cynicism, and then, as you say, kind of blind, like not accepting anything. And hopefully journalists are at that point where we're always skeptical, rarely cynical, and definitely not on the extreme of not believing anything.
When we spoke last week, you kind of cautioned me to avoid big philosophical topics. But I feel like it's almost impossible to do that in the context of a discussion.
So
like
that whole
this.
conversation we had is
it is meaningless to me.
Fantastic.
So I'm going to just plow on with my big
right.
philosophical question, which is, and you've already alluded to it, even though you didn't kind of say the word explicitly, but there's obviously a relationship, or must be a relationship, between trust and truth. And so, can you have one without the other?
Can you have one without the other? Can you have trust without truth? Can you have, I mean, truth is obviously a, like, what does truth mean, right? This is, so I remember one time speaking actually to a university class, and the professor said, there is no such thing as truth. And I said, well, I mean, like, really? What do you mean? He goes, well, you go into a room and you have 5 people, and each one of them has a different perspective, even on this conversation, based on where they're sitting in the room. It's like, okay, fine, I get it. I took a philosophy first-year course as well. And sure, from that perspective, there is no truth. But on a practical basis, for those of us, especially in the world of journalism, and all of you who consume information somehow, somewhere, there is truth. I mean, truth sounds like a big concept, but basically there are things that we know can be proven to be true or are likely true. So I guess part of that is trust. I mean, we do live in a world, I kind of underestimated it until the last few years, where people really do, like a surprising percentage of people really do believe the moon landing was fake, right? I mean, even the flat earther thing, which sounds like a joke, I think there are people who believe that in 2024, that the earth is flat. So everything is being questioned by people, and the beauty, and I don't really mean that it's beautiful, of living in silos, especially when those silos are walled by social media, allows you to keep believing that and live and create your own little world where it's not challenged at all. And it's really troubling for me.
I mean, I think you don't even have to go as far as the kind of playful and slightly ridiculous examples of flat Earth society, et cetera, and this notion that it's kind of alive and affecting our everyday discourse was captured for me in a column last week in the Globe and Mail, and I just want to read you a quote from it. It was written by Deborah Thompson, who's a political science professor at McGill University, who deals a lot with issues around democracy and race. But here she was writing about the upcoming US election, and the title of the column was "Donald Trump is losing it, he still might win the election." And she wrote, "Mr. Trump has little more than a nodding acquaintance with the truth. Being caught in a lie or a scandal, or even a brief moment of too much enthusiasm, used to be enough to sink a political campaign. In the post-truth, fake news, election denialism era of Trumpian politics, veracity is a footnote. Electoral campaigns always feature some degree of political spin, but combating Mr. Trump's claims is like wrestling with wrestling with smoke. The truth, unfortunately, doesn't really matter. What matters is whether people are convinced and whether they will turn out to vote for Mr. Trump's version of the truth in less than 2 weeks." So what's your reaction to that? The notion that for some people, or in some spheres, truth doesn't actually even matter.
Yeah, well, I mean, he is the embodiment of that, right? So, I mean, I would amend that statement a little bit to say, I mean, truth does matter to a lot of people, right? And there are a lot of people who are not going to vote for Trump, and for many of them, it's because they feel that he twists the truth. But there are others who believe everything he says. There's a cultish devotion to him. There are many people, and I ran into this in Detroit a couple of weeks ago when we were doing some coverage on the election in the swing state of Michigan, who are just quite comfortable overlooking all of the things that he said that are true. And it gets exhausting trying to challenge them when I'm doing an interview, and what about this, what about this? And some of the stuff is so complicated, but then some stuff you could just, what about the Haitian people who are eating cats and dogs? I mean, that is not true, right? And I was interviewing a pastor who's African American, who is from Detroit, who is a big supporter of Trump, and I said, as an African American, when you see these kinds of statements from this candidate you adore, and those Haitians are of African descent as well, doesn't that trouble you? And his first response was that, well, Haitians practice witchcraft. And so I said, wait a second, nobody's talking about witchcraft here. It's pretty clear that there is no evidence that Haitian people in, I think it's Ohio or Pennsylvania, Ohio,
Springfield.
I think. Yeah. Are eating cats and dogs. And then he said, well, people are they always try to make Trump out to be the villain. And you just feel like you're in some kind of rhetorical quicksand because you're not having a real conversation. And in his case, and I think this is true of a handful of people at least that I talked to in Michigan, they were willing to overlook all that stuff because there were other things that were more important to them, like the economy. And not even that Trump is better at managing the economy than Kamala Harris would be, but my point is that they're willing to overlook things that, and I think it's implied in that article, that once upon a time, any one of 40 things that Trump has said or done, any one of those 20 years ago would have been disqualifying. I mean, I don't know if a lot of you are quite young, you may not remember Howard Dean. He was a Democratic candidate for the nomination for the party for president, and he was at an event and he was yelling in a microphone. So it was a really, really loud room. He was yelling, and then the audio of that was isolated, and he was screaming. It just sounded weird when you heard that, and that pretty well sunk his campaign to become the Democratic nominee for president. You know, the scream at an event. And you know, you think of a really old reference in Canada, Robert Stanfield, a longtime leader of the opposition in Canada. Many people describe him as the best prime minister we never had, kept losing in elections against Pierre Trudeau. He fumbled a football during a photo op, and that was kind of seen as, you know, he's not the kind of guy that we want as a prime minister. A footnote to that, by the way, I was talking to somebody yesterday from Nova Scotia who was involved in politics, and he said something I had heard, but he said that he knows this for sure, that there were multiple footballs thrown that day to Stanfield, who was actually a fairly athletic guy. He caught all of them but one. And it happened to be the moment when the newspaper photographers were taking pictures. They're looking for an interesting photograph. They weren't trying to ruin his campaign, but the picture of him fumbling for the football really did hurt his campaign. Again, it just seems like a quaint thing, almost. Like it was wrong, it was unfortunate, had nothing to do with his ability to be a prime minister, but it seems like such a quaint, archaic notion that would disqualify somebody to be leader when you see the things that Trump has done. But there are definitely people who don't care about the truth. But look, you know, the last time that Trump ran for president, as many votes as he got, Biden got more votes, right? So, and there are lots of reasons for that, but I think that it also is that maybe the people who voted for Biden, a lot of them, truth matters.
The Ian fumbles a football portion of today's proceedings will be a little bit later on.
Yeah, well,
football's in the bag right there.
Every football thrown to me.
So now, in an attempt to do what you wanted me to do, which is not ask you big philosophical questions, let's bring it back kind of more concretely to this issue of who do you trust. So let me put it on you. How do you decide who and what to trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is a feel, you know, like I do consume a lot of news, and you can just kind of tell as you read an article whether it's trustworthy to you or not. And then over time, so I have a subscription to the New York Times. I have a lot of faith in what the New York Times does. I still read articles critically, and particularly opinion pieces. Some of them I'll start reading an opinion piece in the New York Times and not finish it because it's not offering me anything. But generally speaking, I find the stories, you know, feel like they're done in good faith. They feel like they're accurate. Yes, to that philosophy professor, it is the perspective of one person at one moment in time who's bringing to that article all of their life experiences and their implicit biases. I get that. But generally speaking, I trust it. But I've always believed in the model where you try to consume as much news as you can from sources that you believe are credible, and you kind of triangulate, you know. So I have a subscription to the Globe, to the Vancouver Sun, to the Toronto Star, and you look at, you know, none of us have time to be always looking at multiple sources, but I try to, you know, and then you kind of figure out when you see an overlap of a perspective, you kind of think, okay, you know, that sort of suggests a little bit more credibility there. And when you see the differences, you ask yourself, are the differences ideological, or because of the quality of the journalism, or because of the access that that journalist had? And you just try to figure it out. But I would strongly one of the beautiful things about a democracy is, well, I guess two great things about it. Ultimately, we get to decide things like who we vote for. We get to decide what we believe. But the second thing is, there's a responsibility there, right? To be someone who is a critical thinker. And I feel like in a university setting, that's especially true. But I kind of challenge myself and challenge all of you to be critical thinkers as you consume information.
You described your process of coming to trust through very much the consumer lens. Mm-hmm. But I'm also curious to get your thoughts on how you view that as a journalist and how you do your own work, and whether trust is something that you think about in your process and in what you put out there in the world.
Yeah, so there's no story that I've spent more time on or care more about than the COVID story. And although it has become not a headline story in the last year or so, it was obviously the biggest story between 2020 and 2022, 23. So I spent a lot of time researching it, talking to people, and assessing expertise. And it became very clear to me when I would interview somebody or when I would read what somebody had written, it became very clear to me who was credible and who wasn't. And I made decisions, and the thing about anybody who's worked at the CBC or other news organizations knows, no single person makes a decision about who you end up putting on a program. It's a very collegial process, and so I was part of that group both on the nights that I would anchor the National and also on Cross Country Checkup. And there's certain experts that I felt were credible. I'd listened to their analysis. I'm not a scientist, but again, you just use your critical thinking tools, and there were many people that I felt were very credible, and there were many people who clearly were not credible. I think we'll talk a little bit more about the pandemic story as we go on, because it's really interesting to me that there are two groups of people out there who are really angry about pandemic coverage and about pandemic public policy. On the one side, the people who are, anti-vaxxers, but it's more complicated than that, still have a lot of anger about lockdowns and about vaccine requirements. And then there's another group that I think on the political spectrum is quite far away from them, but shares their anger about pandemic policy, and they tend to feel that we should still have restrictions like masking, and so that group in particular really doesn't like me, or Keith Baldry, or there are a handful of other reporters. I actually always feel kind of proud when they tag on social media Keith and I, because I think Keith is such a terrific reporter. I think, well, that's pretty good company to be in. But I don't think that's the intention of the people who are criticizing us. And so one of the things that group criticizes me for is not talking to the experts that they believe are the ones that I should talk to. And so lately, one person in particular, who's a professor at York University, keeps tagging me in tweets and says, I ask you to consider interviewing these people. And then a whole bunch of other people reply to it. I would say, actually, it was almost exactly a year ago. I think it was on Halloween last year when I replied to not one of his tweets, but a similar tweet, and said, I believe very strongly in critical thinking and the importance of journalism, and whatever it was, I thought it was a fairly kind of basic, motherhood statement about journalism. I was wrong. Because every time I picked up my phone, there were another 50 notifications, and pretty well all of them explaining why that tweet was, naive or gaslighting, and it just kept coming in, kind of ruined my Halloween. And then I went for a walk the next day, and And nobody mentioned the tweet. Nobody mentioned the reaction to the tweet. I walk a lot in Vancouver, and when I do, a certain number of people will recognize me and say hello, and it was the same that day as it was every day. And you kind of learn that just because there are 150 people who are intensely fixated on a topic, and they all retweet each other, and they're all really angry, and it shows up on your timeline as 150 notifications, it doesn't really represent what's happening out there in the real world. And I'm under strict instructions from my younger son, my sons are both adults, but my younger son, to stop tweeting about COVID. And so I try to live up to that. And in fact, the other day, I did tweet about COVID coverage, and my son is going to university in Alberta, and sure enough, I get a text from him. He said, "Dad, why are you doing this?" And I said, well, it's important. It has to do with, credibility and balance, and I want to defend myself. He said, do you take on the chemtrails people? Like, don't take these people on. And so I've learned to try to silence my notifications or not jump into these unwinnable arguments.
But that's a very interesting point, I guess, that you're making, which also came up in an interview you did recently with Malcolm Gladwell, the author of The Tipping Point, a journalist well known for kind of sociological writing and trying to develop an understanding of why ideas gain prominence in society. You interviewed him both for The National on air, and also you interviewed him as part of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. And in the TV interview, you were asking him about how can we create a less polarized, less angry society. And it's interesting because his response actually bears directly on this issue. He said, there was some really fascinating analysis done during COVID of the anti-vaccine movement. There were 3 sources for something like 70% of the anti-vax information online. That tells us that sometimes what we perceive to be as a broad-based movement is not. It is a movement that's being fueled by a very small number of people who've managed to amplify their voice. And Gladwell said, and I think that helps us to put what looks like division into some perspective. I suspect that a lot of what we feel is division is not actually division. So, my view of that is, sure, that's great. It feels nice to know that Gladwell thinks that and that is actually the case. But the amplification, to me, is the bigger issue or the problem. And what is the fact that 3 sources can have their views amplified so significantly that it becomes an actual thing that you have to deal with? And how does that affect our ability to assess credibility and who and what to trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all still learning how to assess social media, right? There's some people who ignore it all. There's some people who are obsessed by it. There's some people who value themselves and certainly their posts by the amount of engagement they get. I mean, I do to an extent. Like if I post something and there's no engagement or there are no likes, I kind of feel badly about that. And so does it matter? Like, does anything, well, this gets very existential. Does anything matter? Like if you're talking, that philosophy professor, when I was in first year, taught us about, and you've all been in a class, I'm sure, where they talk about the tree that falls and no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. I mean, if you send out a post on social media and you get no likes, does it make a sound? I don't know. But if it gets, sometimes they're news.
Do you like your own posts when you do those ones?
I've accidentally liked my own posts, and then I unlike them. Yeah. But sometimes you see news stories that'll say, the reaction on social media was, there was a lot of criticism on social media, and I feel like that's the laziest line you could possibly use in news coverage because. So what? So it's kind of like saying reaction is mixed. Of course reaction is mixed. Of course there was stuff on, but then sometimes I make the mistake and I think to myself, man, like this person is really getting hammered on social media and we're all busy and you're kind of going through a bunch of stuff really quickly. And then I catch myself and just think, there was a time when we started posting articles on the internet at CBC and I would hear back from people that I interviewed. And they would say how dismayed they were by the negative comments that were on the internet. So one time, for example, I interviewed somebody. He was the second person to be jailed after the 1994 riot. And he, I won't go too long in the story, but it is a fascinating story. He was in Surrey with his friends getting drunk. They saw the coverage of the 1994 riot, and they decided to do what anyone would do who's drunk in that situation, jump on the SkyTrain and head downtown. He got out at the Burrard SkyTrain station, and he saw a police officer with a police dog trying to move people back, and then he made the second decision that we would all make in that circumstance, which was to fight the police dog. And the footage is on the internet. Anyway, I could go on. It was a fascinating sort of time in his life. But we interviewed him after the 2011 riot because I thought it would be interesting to kind of hear what was it like. First of all, what was his motivation to do what he did? Alcohol, basically. And then secondly, he was sentenced to 3 months in jail, which doesn't sound like a lot, but he explained that it was a lot. The very first day that he was in jail in British Columbia, a guy closed the door to a library in the facility that he was in and said that it was another inmate, and said he was going to rape this guy. And this guy said to the person who threatened to rape him that only one of us is going to walk out of here if you try that. And I said to this guy, like, did you mean it? And he said, yeah, like, you know, I realized I had to fight or you know, I would be a victim in the 3 months I was there. Anyway, so he told his story. It was an amazing story that he told. And then the comments on the internet were overwhelmingly negative, although that may be redundant to say that, you know, comments on the internet are overwhelmingly negative. And he felt really, really hurt by it. And I remember saying to my bosses at the CBC, because of that story and a handful of other stories, maybe we should not allow comments on these articles. And they said, no, we should have the comments. Well, finally, we decided not to do it, and it actually had to do with so many negative comments on Indigenous issues that were so hateful that the CBC finally decided that we weren't going to allow comments on things that we were posting, or many of the things we were posting. And then there was a whole backlash from people who were angry about that. But ask yourself, when's the last time that comments on the internet actually gave you insight that you didn't otherwise have? You know, when's the last time they went on YouTube and went through the comments and thought, oh, yeah, there's a really analytical point there. So we've kind of learned to not get to, either to not allow those comments at all, and we're not poorer for it, or to just kind of disregard those comments. I think in the world of social media, we're not yet at that point, trying to figure out how to deal with it. And I think, for example, on the people who are claiming that, there are some people out there who are still saying that the BC election results are fake or were manipulated. I wish there was a way to quickly assess how many people are actually saying that, and then assess their accounts to see whether they're real people or not. Like, I do that occasionally, and you kind of look at the timeline, you look at that person's account, and you can quickly tell they're a bot, or they may be a real person, but they're so one-sided. And actually, and I think we're going to talk about this in a moment, but I moderated a discussion last night on artificial intelligence. And one of the interesting things in that conversation was how optimistic most of the people were, and these were experts and academics talking how optimistic they were about artificial intelligence. And one of the things they talked about is how it can, just like, you know, when people marveled at the computing ability of our phones, for example, and able to do things quickly that before we weren't able to do, artificial intelligence also, if it, you know, can do semi-intelligent or maybe very intelligent searches of the internet almost instantly. And I would love to have that done of controversial posts or you know, potentially fake posts, so we can better assess, you know, what social media is actually reflecting out there. You know, remember, and again, I'm trying to gauge from the age of people here whether you will remember this, but the Arab Spring, and how at that moment a lot of people felt that that was the promise of Twitter. That individuals in the middle of a revolution where they felt that government was controlling the message in the mainstream media, that Twitter would be this incredibly liberating force that would allow revolutions to happen and you know, defend liberty. Didn't work out that way, right?
And then Elon Musk bought it.
And then Elon Musk got it, yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you something about your Tesla, but I guess I won't.
No comment.
But anyway, so I would be very interested to do a deeper dive into some of these social media issues and to what extent, because we do have to keep our ear to the ground, right? Especially as journalists, and we do it in unscientific ways. Like I did it when I was in Michigan 2 weeks ago. Like I said, very unscientific. You know, I totally understand. You drop into a place for 3 days, you talk to 25 people. I mean, that gives me some insight, but it certainly doesn't make me an expert on how people are feeling there. Although you try to triangulate that again with what you see from survey results and what you read in people's coverage, and then kind of reflect what you heard as well. But anyway, it's very easy to misinterpret social media, and it's very easy for social media to make things appear like the world is on fire, when, as Malcolm Gladwell would point out, quite often it's not a reflection of that.
Just a reminder that we'll have an opportunity for you all to ask questions of Ian in a little while. But I heard that you moderated a panel on artificial intelligence just last night.
There you go.
Was there kind of, you know, obviously artificial intelligence, you can talk about all sorts of different aspects of it, but I'm particularly interested as the AD of Broadcast and Media Communications about the effect of, or impact of, or consequence of artificial intelligence in journalism and credibility. And at the same time, as somebody who works at an academic institution, some of the challenges around responsible use of artificial intelligence as a teaching tool, as a learning tool, as a content creation tool. So what of that came up in the panel you moderated last night?
Yeah, so my answers have been going on too long, and I do encourage you to ask questions on anything, and as challenging as you want them to be, that's absolutely fine, and I think it'll be a good process. So let me try to answer that question in a short version as opposed to a long version, but unfortunately there are 3 things I would say about it. One is, I did an interview actually 2 weeks ago in Ottawa. I interviewed the Director General of the BBC, the boss of the BBC. And it was an hour long, and he said, you know, you can ask me anything. We chatted a little bit before, but he said, here's some things that I wouldn't mind talking about. And one of them was artificial intelligence. And I thought, boy, you know, he's going to talk about the dangers of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, and he didn't, actually. He talked about how the BBC is currently using artificial intelligence and how good it is for them. And one example he gave is that in sports coverage, they feel it's important to connect with audiences by doing a lot more local sports coverage than they're doing, besides the kind of national matches. But they don't have the resources to put a lot of people on the air during those matches. So they'll have one person, I don't know in Britain if they call them, you know, play-by-play announcers. We would if it was a hockey game here, but they'd have one person on these games, but then artificial intelligence is being used by the BBC to put information on the screen based on how the game is going. And so if it's 2-0, the artificial intelligence that they have employed will be able to do what a color commentator would otherwise do and say, well, this is, you know, the 3rd time that this team has been down 2-0 after the first half, et cetera. And it enhances the coverage, right? So I thought that was interesting, and that isn't where I thought he was going to go. Last night, I would say 2 things, well, yeah, 2 things about what the experts and then some academics who weren't experts in artificial intelligence. First of all, they were really concerned about, they felt that too many people were too pessimistic about artificial intelligence. And the Nobel Prize winner, the Canadian Nobel Prize winner, Hinton, I think his first name is Jeffrey or Jeremy, anyway, he just gave a speech in the last couple of days where he talked about, I think, a 20% chance that artificial intelligence will lead to the extinction of the human race.
Right.
And then another speaker at that event said, well, sort of a 10% chance. That was not the tone of the people who spoke at the event that I was at the University of Toronto yesterday. And actually one person said that studies suggest that people tend to assume the worst about new technology. And I remember in 1995 being at an event in Vancouver, actually, public lecture, where somebody said that the internet is the worst thing that's ever happened to civilization. And he paused, this is 1995, and then he said, the internet is also the best thing that's ever happened to human civilization. And it's hard even for me to remember how transformative the internet has been in so many ways. You know, Mike Kalina and I both covered the handover in Hong Kong in 1997. You were over there. I went over briefly, but I remember in 1997 as I prepared to go on that trip, using email for the first time in a meaningful way and marveling at the fact that I could send an email at 5 o'clock or 6 p.m. Pacific time, and then someone in Hong Kong could respond to it, and the next morning I got this reply. It sounds, you talk about, you know, archaic, it sounds like weird that that was something that I marveled at, but that's where we were in 1997. You know, I had a cell phone with me in 1992 covering the LA riots, big cell phone, like about this big, and it ran out of battery power after about 2 hours. But it was also transformative. And so AI is going to be transformative as well. And so this one of the people who was at this session, I actually am answering too long, I'm sorry, but one of the people at this session is an agriculture professor at Guelph University. And she was talking about the advances that are being made in artificial intelligence to help empower farmers when it comes to things like irrigation, to just have assessments made in a way that government agencies aren't able to, to sort of give you a micro assessment of what you should be doing at your farm based on the data. And she was saying that that is going to be transformative. But she also said one of the issues they're talking about at Guelph is the farmers' information, they want to keep it out of the hands of the big companies, the seed companies, for example, right? So privacy is an issue. They're also concerned about access to this technology in an equitable way. So not just for a corporate farmer, but also for a First Nations community. How are you going to make sure that you're not giving an unfair advantage to some groups over other groups? But I would say that generally speaking, they were, and I guess the other thing two other things I'll quickly say that I thought was important.
Are we at 3 now, or are we at 5?
We're at 3C and 3D, and then I will finish.
Right.
So 3C is this. A guy who's a professor at University of Alberta, who's an expert in artificial intelligence and who worked for, I think it was Google, but one of the big tech companies for 5 years, he says, we have to make sure that we don't let big tech control the conversation on artificial intelligence. That governments, people, academics, people who aren't driven by a profit motive need to be the people who lead this conversation. That's number one. And number two, this would be 3E, I guess, and then I'm done, is they described it as guardrails. That's probably not the best metaphor, because I think we need something bigger than a guardrail, but we do need protections. But where the Nobel Prize laureate thinks there's I think it was 20% chance that artificial intelligence will lead to the extinction of the human race, I didn't get that sense last night.
I just want to ask one more thing before we turn it over to the audience for questions, because I tried to ask it before and you sort of deflected and didn't answer the question. And that is this, and I'll put it more explicitly because maybe I was a little too subtle last time.
Well, you're not being subtle now.
I'm not, well, I haven't said anything yet. I'm issuing too many disclaimers. One might argue that one of the challenges or one of the reasons why there is a trust issue for consumers of content, and I'm thinking news specifically, with the mainstream media, is because you're not transparent enough about how you know things and what your process is to gain that knowledge. I'm curious to get your reaction to that slightly provocative statement.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's provocative at all. We do need to be more transparent. Even on something like the decision desk, and I saw actually, I think there was an article online about how the CBC decision desk makes its decisions. So on election night, we have a group of people, and they tell the people who are on the air when we can say that we are projecting that somebody's elected in a riding, right? I didn't really know how we made that process. I trusted that they were making the process properly and for the right reasons, and in fact, they turned out to be correct, sometimes a little slow for my liking, but still correct. But yeah, we weren't very good at being transparent. We need to be, you know, and so I don't find that provocative at all. So that's number one. Number two, we live in an era of sloganeering, right? So there are people who can say, back to the COVID thing, some of the doctors that I interview and rely on, and some of the reporters like myself, are dismissed as minimizers. Well, when you're a minimizer, you don't have to actually have a debate about why your coverage is bad or why that doctor is not to be trusted. He or she is a minimizer. Well, it's the same with fake news. When somebody just dismisses what I do as fake news, and occasionally I will run into somebody in the field who will say, you know, yeah, just fake news. What's the next thing you say, right? Like there's no room for discussion or debate because you've just dismissed people on the basis of that. So yes, we need to be more transparent, but it's unfortunate that there are some people who, with just one phrase that doesn't seem to be based on anything, wants to dismiss what we do. And then I guess the final thing I'll say on this is and I think we're doing a better job at this at CBC than we used to, but we need to own up to our mistakes. And then the problem with owning up to your mistakes is there are people who will seize on that and say, oh, there you go again, you know, another mistake by the CBC. But then again, I hope people in the public put that in perspective. And you do, I don't know how many stories in a day that major news organizations do, in the hundreds for sure. And there are going to be mistakes. Every organization makes mistakes. And yeah, I think we need to be transparent about our process and transparent about our shortcomings. But then, you know, there are the other ones that are more difficult. You know, you think about the last few years as we went from Me Too being a big story to the residential school graves being a big story, to Black Lives Matter being a big story. Like, all of those stories were incredibly important, captivated huge numbers of people, like the imaginations, the emotions, the passions of huge numbers of people. But within our newsrooms, those three stories in particular, those three issues in particular, created, you know, like really deep emotional discussions, right? We had people in tears, I can remember, in newsroom meetings on some of those issues. And so it's been a really difficult time, and maybe I think magnified a little bit by how COVID affected all of us. But it's been a really difficult time, I think, in the world, but in newsrooms as well. And being transparent about all of that, it would be difficult and kind of sensitive, right? Yeah.
I mean, I could push you more on transparency, but
No, do.
Well, I mean, you say news organizations need to be more transparent, but they're, for the most part, not.
Yes.
They're black boxes to the consumers of their content. And so I'm curious, without kind of putting you too much on the spot.
No, but go. I really,
so
honestly,
give me some concrete. Give us some concrete measures that ought to be taken by journalists and news organizations to be transparent.
Well, one thing I would like to see us do is and one of the beautiful things is with websites, like, you have so much real estate and so much flexibility, you know, and I would love us to have a dialogue, ongoing dialogue, where people can make their critical comments and we can respond to them. And the dialogue doesn't mean you just put an article out there and just allow comments to it, but you actually take the time to moderate them. That was a big problem with a lot of the comments on the web, is that people either weren't doing anything to control them, or were only eliminating the ones, deleting the ones that were particularly egregious, right? But because it takes time and money to have somebody actually create a dialogue. But that's what we should be doing, right? And then the other part to that, which would be really difficult, is if it is one of those emotional issues I was talking about, and then it's a story, let's say, about, oh, let me just give this is completely theoretical, but let's say a story about temporary foreign workers and what impact temporary foreign workers are having on employment of Canadians, permanent residents, on wages, on housing, right? Think of all those stories, how fraught those stories are, and how we need to find a place. Like, we take on all kinds of big issues and controversy, so we need to find a place where we can have a conversation with our viewers and readers and listeners, and explain how we do the things that we do. I've argued for that for a while, and we don't do it, and I wish we did. We have a chief editor, news editor, who puts out really thoughtful statements, so that's good. But I would love to see more of a dialogue.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, one of the parts of the work that I used to do that I found the most interesting was getting into the guts of this kind of stuff and responding to viewers who were complaining about basically the black box nature of what we did. Okay, so thank you. I was slightly hard on you, and you had a good answer.
Good.
I think this is a good opportunity to take some questions from the audience, and I hope that people will push Ian in a respectful way.
Or disrespectful.
Or disrespectful, and ask him all sorts of questions about trust and truth, etc. So right here with the leather jacket, why don't we start there? Joanne has a mic.
Somebody's going to bring a microphone to you.
Justin's bringing you a microphone. Hold on 1 sec. There you go.
My name is Ryan. I'm a second-year journalism student here. You talked a lot. This presentation was built a lot about trust, and there was a period of time where news anchors were the most trusted people on television. I think when Walter Cronkite came back to Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson said, "If we lost Cronkite, we lost America." Now we're living in an age where the former president is saying that the ABC News should have their license revoked because they fact-checked him. Can that trust with viewers and stuff like that, can that trust be rebuilt, and how can we sort of rebuild that trust?
So when I interviewed Malcolm Gladwell, one of the questions I asked him is, as a guy who observes society and has interesting theories about why people do the things they do, I said, back in 2016, he was asked on The National by Wendy Mesley, what will happen if Trump gets elected president? And Gladwell said that he'll be in jail within a year. He was wrong. And so I asked Malcolm Gladwell about that, and he said, yeah, I really got that wrong. And I said, why is it that Donald Trump is so difficult to predict, and the impact of Donald Trump, the way people react to him? And he didn't have a good answer for that. Donald Trump defies predictions, and the people who follow him defy understanding to a lot of us, right? So the fact that, there are a lot of things going on there where we go from the era of Cronkite being, this trusted icon in America. Although even that, I would say there's an asterisk to that, because if you look back at the turmoil of the 60s and 70s and the Vietnam War, I'm sure that there were a lot of people who didn't trust Walter Cronkite, who thought that he was a shill for the communists. One of the things, though, if you felt that way, you didn't get a chance to tweet it and then have that tweet retweeted 400,000 times. There wasn't Fox News that would have taken on Walter Cronkite over and over again. You basically, in the United States, had 3 networks, and they had more or less the same view of the world, I think in a good way, like thoughtful people. But now you have a lot of other opportunities for people to have a different point of view and get a lot of attention, right? So it's quite possible that Walter Cronkite was not as trusted as he was thought to be, that there were a lot of people who rejected. I mean, the whole idea that people would believe that the moon landing was fake, right? And certainly none of the 3 network anchors would have sort of supported that at all. But then you have right now, you have Donald Trump basically questioning everything, including the credibility of news, and a lot of people who support him and believe that. And how do we come back from that? I mean, the other thing is that's the United States, it's not Canada. And even though we see echoes of what's going on in the United States in Canadian kind of public debate, I still think and hope we're a lot different. But like it's our job to be more transparent, to try to build credibility, and I mean, I still run into a lot of people who watch the news or read the news or see us on TikTok and don't believe everything we say, which is important because I get stuff wrong, but at the same time, at least turn to all of us. And when I say, I mean, I'm a big fan of CTV, so much so I got criticized from one of my bosses when I was quoted when Lisa LaFlamme was let go as saying that CTV is a high quality, credible newscast. And she said, why did you say that? And, I said it because it's true, because I believe it, right? So I think we still do have lots of trusted news sources here, but we're being challenged, and that's good. At the end of the day, it's up to us to use all the tools we have to try to build trust.
Another question? At the back? Yeah, Justin, thank you.
Thank you. Just picking up on your story or your suggestion of developing dialogue online. I think one of the challenges from my point of view in reading the news is there's an escalation even in the news reporting, in the sense that something might start off with, well, there was a few people hurt, and then suddenly there's hundreds hurt, and then next, it's thousands. I think one of our challenges is that a lot of our news is in sound bites. So without the development of those further opportunities for discussion, as you've put out there, then we read the soundbite, that's all we hear is a soundbite. And certainly in our politics in Canada right now, it's a lot of soundbites. So how do we develop a fuller, richer newscast that not only moves it from soundbites to a full story that is transparent, but also cite sources, that people can do some fact checking on their own to get more information and a deeper understanding?
It's funny, as you ask that question, I think to myself, we're kind of in the golden age of long-form journalism. Because when we had fewer channels, then television news and radio news were 2 big sources of information. And then we had, some people would talk about the 30-second clip. It's like the 8-second clip. And then radio newscasts are even tighter than television newscasts. But these days, although you still have those media, we also have news channels. And on Power and Politics, or the CTV equivalent, you have an hour or 2 to get way beyond the soundbite. Rosemary Barton has a show every week that has powerhouse interviews and goes in depth on things. The House on CBC Radio. And then besides, newspapers are diminishing in their impact for lots of economic reasons about their advertising revenue, but everybody's got stuff on the web, and there are lots of long reads on there. And so lots of opportunities to go beyond the soundbite. In terms of what you said at the beginning about, a few people are dead, more people are, I don't know exactly what the context of that is, but I would say that, you look at a hurricane, for example, and everybody is doing their best to try to get the best information about that, and information changes over time, right? Although, again, talking about trust and fake news, I thought if there was anything in these divided times in the United States that would not lead to division, it would be reporting about a hurricane, and yet meteorologists in Florida were getting death threats. Like, what world do we live in where a meteorologist is getting a death threat for the coverage that they're doing? So, I mean, this is a particularly challenging time.
This question is actually a really interesting one, though, because while on the one hand, it's a great time to be alive because there's so much content out there that you can turn to for in-depth analysis. On the other hand, we decreasingly have time. We face information overload, and it is hard to discern, what is the best information. So how do you deal with this kind of, on the one hand, the need to go deeper, to understand better, to have better trust, and on the other hand, it's not compatible with the pace of life in 2024, 2025?
Last night at this artificial intelligence roundtable meeting discussion, somebody said we need better artificial intelligence literacy about artificial intelligence. People need to learn more about what it is. And then I said, okay, I'll ask the naive question. I'm the one non-scientist in this room. Can somebody give me a one-paragraph definition of artificial intelligence? And no one could.
They should have looked it up using artificial intelligence. Very meta.
Anyway, and I would say that in terms of trust in media and consuming media, we need to, this has always been the case, but I think it's more the case now than ever, build literacy when it comes to consuming media. And at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of personal responsibility, right? People, yes, there's this barrage of sources and information coming towards us, but we have free will and we can make decisions. And it's just like, you walk into the supermarket and there's a whole bunch of food. You don't have to eat it all.
Right.
And it's the same thing with information out there. Exercise some free will, use critical thinking, try to assess on your own what is credible and what isn't. And I mean, I fall prey to this too. Like, I'll have conversations with people and I'll say, yeah, I understand that, that this thing happened and that, city manager is doing a really bad job. And they go, why? And it's like, I'm thinking, oh, I saw a headline that said the city manager is doing a bad job, And so, we just need, we have the power to go beyond the soundbite now, and maybe in a way that we didn't 30 years ago. And we have the power to go beyond the tweet.
Another question? Aidan.
Hi, my name is Aidan. I'm a first-year broadcast journalism student. And I'd like to open up by saying that I deeply respect you. But I did want to ask you about the recent efforts to defund the CBC or to cut funding to them. What do you make of that, and what does that mean for journalism's future in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, so what do you make of journalism's future in Canada? Defund the CBC aside, right? We're in a challenging time. But it's funny, we just were talking about all the different sources of information. So it's just a time of incredible churn, and we're all trying to figure out what media is going to look like in 5 years, right? And so, and where people are going to get their information. Okay, let's park that for a moment. In terms of defund the CBC, one of the things I find interesting is that in our newsroom, we don't talk about it. It doesn't kind of motivate our coverage. You just keep doing the job that you're doing, So theoretically, if Pierre Poilievre becomes the Prime Minister, will he fulfill his promise to defund the CBC? And what does that mean? But I can tell you, it does not figure into our editorial decisions or our coverage at all. We have, for example, on Cross Country Checkup, a standing invitation to Pierre Poilievre to be on the program. He has not taken up that invitation, but he's welcome anytime. And so, what happens if he gets elected and he makes that decision? Is he turning off the lights already?
No, Carlos was leaning on the lights, I think.
Anyway, so we'll see. But and in terms of the future of this business, I don't have to tell you, as a first-year broadcast journalism student, we are in uncertain times anyway in terms of this business. But at the end of the day, people still need information. And so the question will be, where will they get it? And one of the things I'm fascinated about, by the way, is the people like Ryan Jesperson in Edmonton, who has a daily podcast and a video version of that as well, called Real Talk. He was a guy who was hosting a daily radio talk show on CHED, which is kind of the CKNW of Edmonton. He got fired for reasons that I think were justified. And he's built this podcast that I listen to occasionally. It's kind of very Alberta-centric, which it should be. But 3 years in, he gets really good guests and seems to be doing a show that is as good as or better than what he did at CHED. And I'm hoping that that's a little bit of the future, that it's possible for people to create programs like that on their own.
Another question? Yeah. You. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much. Ian, thanks so much for being here. I'm Gabe. I'm also a first-year broadcast journalism student. I'm curious because the title there caught my eye. I have always, one of the sort of quotes and sayings that I've always heard is that the truth doesn't need defending, right? Because you have to defend a lie, but you don't have to defend the truth. And again, it caught my eye because I think to myself, could someone not point at you and what you're doing here and say that you are here because you're trying to defend the truth and why people should believe you? Like, could you not argue that you should just go about doing your job? Because if you are in fact reporting the truth, there's no need for you to answer the question who you can trust, because you should just do what you're paid and passionate about doing.
Yeah, so I don't know the context of truth doesn't need defending, but I would say practically speaking, we're seeing lots of examples of why what I do needs defending, needs explanation, needs transparency, and we live in a world where there's some people who will question everything. So again, I have one friend in particular who always is has a cynical view of everything. So cynical view of the justice system, cynical view of policing.
It's not me, is it?
No. and so for example, when the young woman from Halifax, Matea Roach, was winning on Jeopardy, I remember just being enchanted by how smart she was and how it was going. I interviewed her a couple of times. She's amazing. And then this friend of mine said, well, they are manipulating the episodes to create her winning. And it's like, what? And he goes, yeah, like if you look at it, he watches Jeopardy all the time, and they're giving her easier questions so she can keep winning. And I was saying, really? And I thought, this guy believes nothing about anything. And I said, and if the people in Jeopardy were going to manipulate their process in order to create a winner, would they choose a non-binary person from Nova Scotia to be that champion? I don't think so. And so I think we are in a time where truth, whatever that is, or maybe more accurately, my attempt to report things in an honest way, I think it does need, if not defending, at least explanation, right? And I think if we don't do that, we're just going to sink deeper in this kind of swamp of mistrust.
So I think we have time for one more question. Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, Ian. Pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. I wanted to ask you a question as a parent. I realized running with my teenage son last spring, it occurred to me that I don't watch the news with my children. I listen to it while I'm making dinner. I grew up in a CBC house, so I could hum all of the theme song in the world. So that, but I don't take the time to sit down and watch with them. My parents used to watch the National. It was like a thing that one did in the house. And I realized that trust is a verb, sort of, it's an action that you have to kind of make time to build a relationship and trust, and I haven't been doing that with them. So we started to talk about, where would you go for information? And very sweetly, he said, well, I go to you, She was like, yes. But we talked about funding sources with news. We weren't running very hard, obviously, and some of those other pieces of how you determine that. But I wonder, as a parent or other journalists, you see, obviously your children have a sense of trust because you work there and this is your field and they know that. But back to what Dan was saying about time, where do I shoehorn in the time so that building that, you know, in this next generation where I think they've seen more news anchors on a daily news show like Jon Stewart than I've actually let them see a real news show. And I just wondered what you're seeing out there. Like, how are other parents taking the time and putting that effort in to let their children build that trust?
Yeah, so not a bad place to end this conversation. I mean, I think that there was a promo that the National did probably 30 years ago, probably 30 years ago. And it had different scenes in Canada where people would just get up, stop what they were doing, and head in to watch the National. But you didn't know what they were doing. So they're in the kitchen and they're heading to the living room. They're outside. They're heading inside. And then the last part, you saw Mansbridge up on the screen, and it, you know, good evening. This is the National. And the idea was that at 10 o'clock, whatever it was, 1.5 million people would get there in front of their TV. And at 11 o'clock, it was more people probably watching CTV National News. And that was the era. I mean, that's done. That's over. And a lot of that has nothing to do with trust, but it has to do with the fact, like when I was a kid, if I wanted to, so I grew up on the East Coast, and so hockey games started at 9 o'clock Atlantic time, 8 o'clock Eastern time. And so by the time I went to bed when I was a little kid, the games were still underway. And so the next day, you look at the newspaper, and it would have partial scores because by the time the newspaper had been put to bed and printed, the games weren't over yet. And so I had to wait until the 6 o'clock news to find out what the scores were, or maybe I'd hear it on the radio. Certainly I wouldn't see the highlights until the 6 o'clock news, right? Obviously those days are gone. You know, you can get information and video at any time in your palm, right? So the idea of sitting down at 10 o'clock or 6 o'clock or any time and devoting half an hour or an hour to watch the news, that's just old news, right? And I don't think, I don't miss that, he says, as a guy who hosts an hour-long newscast on Fridays and Sundays. I mean,
and a 2-hour-long radio show, 2.5.
Yeah, and a 2-hour. Well, the radio show, like, I won't. People listen to the radio as they're, you know, making jam or you know, doing yard work or whatever. But anyway, those days are over. And so, like, part of what we're trying to do, all of us, are finding different ways to get the news to you. And you know, just look at the time when, with television, at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, ABC was going to have the show on, and we would watch it. Those days are gone too, right? We stream when we want, how we want. And we make really brutal decisions. Like, we're brutally tough. You know, 4 minutes in, we don't like it, we go and watch something else. So in the news business, it's going to be our job, and we're working really hard at it, and we're only partially succeeding to meet people where they are. But I think the biggest thing is when you have all these choices, and I just got a note actually from somebody in Toronto saying to me that the Malcolm Gladwell interview, because I did, as Dan said, an interview with him, and it ran on the National on Sunday. He goes, she said, great interview. We got more than 1 million views on TikTok for it, which I think probably means it was a 90-second excerpt from that interview. And she was being serious. Like, that's also part of the way that we're packaging the news. And so I think that we're going to deliver it in a different way. We are doing that now. It's going to look different. It's going to be on demand, but it's still going to come down to trust, right? It's going to be like, we have to work harder to try to make sure that our brands and CTVs and the Globes and, you know, et cetera, global, that trust is there. And so that's the challenge for us. And so I, you know, when Dan gave me this invitation, I was quick to say yes to it because I respect Dan. I have trust in Dan. I also should say, a year after he left the CBC, there's still many conversations in our newsroom where we say, what would Dan do in this situation? Sometimes we mean he would be grumpy, but sometimes it's because he's just a wise person who we very much miss in the newsroom. So very happy to be involved in this. And I thank all of you on a rainy afternoon to you know, sit through all of this, and let's be part of a dialogue. You know, like don't yell at your your TV or whatever the palm of your hand as you're watching us on your phone, talk to us. And talk to us in a meaningful way. Like I still am on Twitter and Threads and Instagram, and on Twitter, it's becoming an increasingly unsatisfying process. But there are times when I actually see a meaningful reaction on Twitter, and it makes me think. And I think, oh, that's good. So, hopefully your son and you and other people here will be part of this dialogue that Dan has goaded me into supporting.
Well, I mean, thank you for being goaded. We appreciate it. Kenton's going to close us off properly, but thank you for coming out on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. And thanks to all of you.
You covered off a lot of ground today. It was amazing. Great way to kick off our speaker series, from elections to artificial intelligence, truth, trust, critical thinking. We could spend another several hours here continuing the discussion.
I know you're all saying, God, no, please. We won't.
Yes. So thank you all for coming. But again, a great thank you to Ian for coming, and thank you to Dan for leading the charge here on today's session. So thanks.
All right, thank you.